A pregnant woman was told she had lost her baby. She had already lived through more than one miscarriage. Now a blood test told her it was happening again, and her doctor began preparing her for the loss. Then a retest came back. The Theranos result had been wrong. Her baby was fine and would be born healthy months later. That result came out of a machine that never worked. Not once. In the 15 years its inventor used it to build a $9 billion company and turn herself into the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and the strangest thing about her story isn't that she lied. It's who lined up to believe her. 2 Secretaries of State sat on her board. So did a 4-star Marine general who would go on to run the Pentagon, a former Secretary of Defense, a Navy admiral who had commanded fleets, 2 United States senators, and the chief executive of one of the biggest banks on Earth. Between them they had started wars and ended them and faced down nuclear powers without blinking. And every one of them staked his name on a device that could not reliably read a few drops of blood, sold to him by a college dropout in her 20s with almost no scientific training. They didn't fall for it because they were stupid. They fell for it because they were powerful, used to being right, unused to being the least informed person in the room. A young woman looked them dead in the eye, dropped her voice into a deep, unhurried baritone, and told them she was going to save the world. And something in the most powerful men in America wanted, badly, to believe her. At her peak, she was worth $4.5 billion on paper. She was on the cover of every magazine that mattered. A sitting vice president toured her lab and praised it to the nation. Reporters called her the next Steve Jobs. And all of it stood on a lie so simple that for more than a decade, almost nobody said it out loud. This is the story of how she pulled it off. It's also the story of the 3 ordinary people who saw straight through it when the billionaires and the generals couldn't. A lab tech, a kid barely out of college, and a stubborn reporter with no army and no title, going up against the most protected company in Silicon Valley. One of them was about to risk everything on the truth. It starts with a girl raised on the memory of a fortune her family had already lost. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Was Raised on Greatness. To understand how Elizabeth Holmes could look a room full of billionaires in the eye and lie without flinching, you have to go back, long before Theranos, long before the black turtlenecks, to a childhood soaked in a very particular kind of pressure. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C. On paper, this was a family at the very center of American power and privilege. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, held executive roles across government and industry. He worked for agencies like USAID and the EPA and, for a time, served as a vice president at a subsidiary of Enron. Yes, that Enron, the energy giant that would later collapse in one of the most infamous corporate fraud scandals in American history. Elizabeth's father worked there during its rise. It's the kind of detail that feels almost too perfect, as if fraud ran in the family. Her mother, Noel Ann Doust, worked on Capitol Hill as a congressional committee staffer, a foreign policy and defense aide who moved through the corridors of Washington with ease. This was a household that understood how power actually worked, how connections got made, how doors opened. But the most important thing about the Holmes family wasn't their present, it was their past. Because Elizabeth grew up on stories of a lost empire, generations back, her family had been genuinely, spectacularly rich. Her great-great-great-grandfather was Charles Louis Fleischmann, a Hungarian immigrant who founded Fleischmann's Yeast, a company that in its day was an industrial powerhouse. On another branch of the family tree stood Dr. Christian Holmes, a physician and hospital builder who helped establish Cincinnati General Hospital and the University of Cincinnati's Medical College. He married Fleischmann's daughter, Betty. For a while, the Holmes name meant medicine and money at once, the 2 great engines of American respectability. And then, over the generations, the money ran out. By the time Elizabeth's father was born, the fortune had thinned to almost nothing. What remained was the memory of it, and a gnawing sense that the family had fallen from something. Joseph Fuis, the son of physician and inventor Richard Fuis, a longtime neighbor of the Holmeses, would later describe the household on the podcast The Dropout as one that took its own history very, very seriously. He said Elizabeth's father carried a real sense of entitlement about the family's importance, a feeling that the world owed the Holmes name a restoration it had somehow been denied. Elizabeth herself later described growing up on those stories. Stories about greatness, and about the tragedy of people who chose not to spend their lives on something meaningful. Read in that light, it's hard not to see a girl who wasn't simply raised to succeed, but, in a sense, raised to reclaim. To put the family name back where it once sat, at the top. That's an interpretation, not a diagnosis. But it's one that many who knew the family have gestured toward, and it runs through almost everything she did next. One story captures it. When Elizabeth was around 9, her father's job uprooted the family again, this time to Texas. She could tell he felt guilty about it. So this little girl wrote her father a note. She didn't write that she wanted to be happy, or safe, or loved. She wrote that what she really wanted out of life was to discover something new, something mankind didn't even know was possible. 9 years old. That's not a childhood wish. That's a mission statement. Family friends painted a picture of a girl who was intense and withdrawn, a little apart from the other kids, pushed hard by a mother who wanted her to invent things and learn languages and become someone the world noticed. By some accounts, she was selling C++ compilers to universities in China as a teenager. She threw herself into her studies. She learned Mandarin. She did not do things halfway. And she had, from the very beginning, a strange relationship with the field she would one day claim to revolutionize. Because Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who would build a $9 billion company on blood, was, by her own account, terrified of needles. It was a fear she said she inherited, one that ran in the family. That fear would later become the founding myth of her entire empire. The girl who hated needles so much she set out to make them obsolete. It's a beautiful origin story, clean and sympathetic, easy to put on a poster. Whether it was ever fully true is another question, because if there's one thing you learn about Elizabeth Holmes, it's that she understood, from a very young age, that the story was the product. The story was the thing people bought, and she was extraordinarily good at telling it. When she left for Stanford, her father handed her a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor's private notebook on Stoic discipline, on enduring hardship, on becoming great through sheer force of will. She would carry that book and that philosophy into everything that came next. She arrived at one of the best universities in the world with a family myth on her shoulders and a fear of the very thing she'd build her company on. She also arrived with an absolute, unshakable certainty that she was destined for something enormous. All she needed now was the idea. Chapter 2. The Dropout. Elizabeth Holmes enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. She did not waste time. Stanford, sitting in the heart of Silicon Valley, is a place designed to turn ambition into companies. The air itself hums with the mythology of the dropout founder, the kid who leaves school, changes the world, and gets rich beyond imagining. Bill Gates did it. Steve Jobs did it. To a young woman raised on stories of lost greatness, that mythology wasn't just inspiring, it was a template. In her freshman year, she found a mentor, Channing Robertson, a respected professor of chemical engineering. Holmes was persistent and magnetic and relentless. She talked her way into his lab, worked alongside PhD students, and impressed him enough that he became one of her most important early champions. Robertson would call her one of the most gifted students he'd ever encountered. That endorsement mattered. It opened the first doors. The summer after her freshman year, Holmes interned at the Genome Institute in Singapore, working on testing for infectious diseases. This was during the SARS outbreak, when the world had suddenly, acutely realized how slow and cumbersome disease testing could be. She came back with an idea burning in her head. That idea, in its first form, was a patch, a wearable device that could sample a patient's blood, test it for infection, and even deliver the right dose of medication in response. It was science fiction. Her mother recalled her sitting down at the computer and barely moving for 5 or 6 days, sleeping an hour or two a night, writing out a patent application for this vision. She could focus with a ferocity that unnerved people. The patch was never realistic, but the core promise underneath it survived. The promise that you could pull enormous amounts of medical information out of a tiny amount of blood, quickly and cheaply and painlessly. That was the seed of everything. That was the pitch she would spend the next 15 years selling. And in 2003, at 19 years old, after about a year at Stanford, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out. She took the money her parents had saved for her education, roughly $100,000 meant to pay for one of the finest educations in the world, and poured it into her company. She would later persuade her parents to invest more, even from their retirement savings. From the very start, Holmes was willing to bet other people's money, including her own family's future, on her certainty. She named the company Theranos, a fusion of two words, therapy and diagnosis, treatment and detection, folded into a single elegant brand. Professor Robertson believed in her enough to join as an early advisor and board member. He connected her to venture capital, and the machine of Silicon Valley began to turn. By the end of 2004, this college dropout, barely out of her teens, had raised around $6 million for a company with no working product, on the strength of a compelling idea and an even more compelling founder. For its first several years, Theranos operated in what the industry calls stealth mode. No flashy website, no press releases, no public claims. Just a young founder, a growing pile of investor money, and a promise wrapped in secrecy. That secrecy became one of her most powerful tools, because you can't disprove what you can't see. The less anyone could examine the technology, the more room there was for the legend to grow. She wasn't building a product yet. She was building a mystique, and she was about to add the final ingredient, a persona so carefully constructed that it would fool some of the sharpest people in the world for the better part of a decade. Chapter 3. Building the Character. One of the strangest facts in this whole story is that the Elizabeth Holmes the world came to know was, to a significant degree, a performance. The stare that didn't blink, the black turtlenecks worn like a uniform, and above all, that famously deep, resonant voice. A character, built on purpose, by her own later admission. Start with the voice. If you've heard Elizabeth Holmes speak in interviews from her peak years, you've heard it. A low, slow, startlingly deep register, dropping well below where you'd expect a woman her age and size to speak. It was hypnotic. It commanded attention. It made her sound older and calmer and more authoritative than her years. And multiple people who knew her before the fame have said it flatly. That wasn't her real voice. Dr. Phyllis Gardner, a Stanford professor who knew her early, said that when Holmes first came to her, she didn't have a deep voice at all. Former colleagues described moments, at a company party, maybe after a drink or two, when Holmes seemed to slip out of character and her natural, higher voice came through, before she caught herself and dropped back down. One former employee suggested she'd adopted the lower register to be taken more seriously, to project authority in rooms full of older men who might otherwise dismiss her. The instinct, calculated as it was, wasn't wrong. Studies have found that lower-pitched voices, in men and women both, tend to read as more competent and more suited to leadership. Holmes seemed to understand this in her bones. She engineered her own vocal cords into a tool of persuasion. Years later, in a rare interview after her conviction, she essentially confirmed the whole thing was constructed. She said the version of herself the world had seen, the low voice, the whole presentation, was a character she'd built as a 19-year-old, a way to be taken seriously and avoid being written off as a little girl with ideas too big for her. Maybe people had sensed it wasn't authentic, she suggested. Because it wasn't. Then there was the look. The black turtleneck. She barely bothered to hide what she was doing, because anyone with eyes could see it. She was cosplaying Steve Jobs. The Apple founder had made the black turtleneck his signature, an emblem of visionary minimalism. Holmes adopted it as a uniform, wearing black turtlenecks and slacks day after day, season after season. The Jobs obsession went deeper than clothing. By numerous accounts from people who worked around her, Holmes studied and imitated Jobs relentlessly, down to his cadence and his showmanship. She hired designers who had worked at Apple to make her blood testing device look sleek and beautiful. When she unveiled a product, she'd pull the little blood collection container out of her pocket with the same theatrical flourish Jobs used to reveal an iPhone. A machine that looks like the future is easier to believe in than one that looks like a science experiment. And the stare. People who met her described the disconcerting way she would fix her large, pale blue eyes on you and simply not blink. The reporter who eventually exposed her wrote that it was almost hypnotic, that it made you feel like the center of the universe. Body language experts have pointed out that unbroken eye contact can be a tool of dominance or of deception. But sitting across from her in the moment, investors and journalists didn't feel manipulated. They felt chosen. They felt like they were in the presence of genius. All of it assembled into something rare, a young woman who understood, better than almost anyone, that in Silicon Valley you don't sell a product. You sell a founder. You sell a story of destiny. You make people feel that betting against you would be betting against the future itself. She had the character. Now she needed an audience with money, and she was about to find the richest, most credulous audience imaginable. Chapter 4. The Believers with the Checkbooks. Every con needs its first mark. Not a victim exactly, but a believer whose belief gives everyone else permission. For Elizabeth Holmes, that first believer came from inside her own social circle. One of her earliest major investors was Tim Draper, a legendary Silicon Valley venture capitalist and the father of one of Holmes's childhood friends. As the story goes, Holmes pitched him her vision, and Draper, who had watched this girl grow up and trusted the family, cut her a check for $1 million. That's how it started, not with rigorous due diligence, with a family friend and a handshake and a feeling. That's the pattern you see again and again. The money that flowed into Theranos rarely came from people who deeply understood diagnostic medicine or laboratory science. It came from people who trusted other people who trusted Holmes. It came from connection, from charisma, from the fear of missing out on the next apple. Another early figure was Donald Lucas, a veteran investor with deep roots in the tech world, a man connected to Oracle's early growth. Through her father's networking, Holmes got in front of Lucas, and Lucas was captivated. He connected her to Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle and one of the richest men on the planet. Ellison invested, and every time a name like that signed on, it worked as a seal of approval that pulled in the next wave. The psychology of a bubble runs like this. Nobody wants to be the one who did the homework and missed the rocket ship. When you see Larry Ellison's name on the cap table, you don't think, I should independently verify whether this blood machine actually functions. You think Larry Ellison is not an idiot. If he's in, I'm in. Trust becomes a chain, and the further along the chain you go, the less anyone at the end has actually kicked the tires. As Theranos grew, that chain reached some of the wealthiest and most powerful families in America. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, reportedly invested around $150 million. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch put in well over $100 million of his own money, commonly reported at around $125 million, making him one of the single largest individual investors. The family of Betsy DeVos, who would later become U.S. Secretary of Education, invested around $100 million. The Cox family, of Cox Enterprises, invested. Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, got involved. None of these are naive people. These are families whose entire fortunes were built on knowing a good deal from a bad one. And they handed Elizabeth Holmes hundreds of millions of dollars, in many cases without demanding the kind of hard, audited proof that would be routine for far smaller investments. Why? Part of it was the story. Part of it was the persona. But part of it was something more subtle, because Holmes had figured out something crucial about how to build unshakable credibility. She didn't just recruit investors, she recruited legends. The men she was about to put on her board weren't there for their money, or even primarily for their business sense. They were there for one reason above all. Their names alone would make Theranos look untouchable. This is where the story turns almost unbelievable. This is where a college dropout in her 20s assembled what one observer called perhaps the most illustrious board of directors in American corporate history. Chapter 5. The All-Star Board, and How She Captured the Powerful Men. In 2011, Elizabeth Holmes was introduced to a man named George Shultz. If the name doesn't land, understand who this was. George Shultz was one of the towering figures of 20th century American government. He served as Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, helping steer American foreign policy through the final, decisive years of the Cold War. Before that, he'd been Secretary of the Treasury and held other top cabinet posts under Richard Nixon. He had sat across the table from Soviet leaders. His reputation for integrity had been forged through some of the most scandal-ridden moments in American political history, and he'd come through them with his good name intact. By 2011, he was in his 90s, an elder statesman, a living monument. Holmes met with him. After a conversation, George Shultz was sold. He joined the board of Theranos. That, more than any single investment, was the masterstroke. Because Shultz didn't just lend his name. He opened his Rolodex, and it held the most powerful people in the Western world. Over the next few years, largely through his introductions and endorsements, Holmes assembled a board that reads like a roll call of American power. The board of this blood-testing startup, run by a 20-something with no medical degree, looked like this. Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, one of the most famous and controversial diplomats in modern history, architect of American foreign policy under Nixon and Ford, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. William Perry, a former U.S. Secretary of Defense. George Shultz himself, the former Secretary of State who'd started it all. Sam Nunn, a former United States Senator who had chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee, one of the most respected voices on national security in the country. Bill Frist, another former U.S. Senator who had served as Senate Majority Leader and who was also a heart and lung transplant surgeon, a rare board member who actually held medical credentials. Gary Roughead, a retired four-star admiral of the United States Navy, a former chief of naval operations who had commanded fleets. James Mattis, the retired Marine Corps general, revered inside the military, who would later become U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Trump. Richard Kovacevic, the former chairman and chief executive of Wells Fargo, one of the largest banks in the country. Riley Bechtel, the chairman and former chief executive of the Bechtel Group, one of the biggest construction and engineering firms in the world. Added up, 2 Secretaries of State, a future Secretary of Defense and a former one, 2 senators, an admiral, a general, a banking titan, an industrial titan. Now the obvious question, what did these men have in common? Diplomacy, defense, national security, banking, construction. And what was missing from that list? Almost anyone who actually understood blood chemistry, laboratory diagnostics, or medical device engineering. Bill Frist aside, this was a board stacked with statesmen and generals, men whose expertise ran to war and diplomacy, not to whether a machine could accurately measure potassium from a finger prick. That was not an accident. That was the design. The board did something specific for Theranos. When a potential investor, or a retail partner, or a journalist looked at this company, they didn't see a college dropout making wild claims. They saw Henry Kissinger. They saw a Secretary of Defense, an admiral, a general, a bank chief. The unspoken logic was overwhelming. These men are not fools. These men have access to the best information in the world. If this company were a fraud, surely they would know. Surely they wouldn't attach their sacred reputations to it. The board was a shield, a halo. It transferred the credibility of American statecraft onto a company that had, at its core, nothing. Credibility by association, weaponized on a scale rarely seen. These men were compensated for their roles, reportedly with fees and large blocks of company stock. Several went further and put in money of their own. Kissinger, for one, personally invested millions in Theranos, and he helped bring in some of the biggest family investors of all. But money wasn't really the point for men of their stature. The point, for Holmes, was that their presence made questioning Theranos feel almost impious. Who was some skeptical reporter to doubt a company that Henry Kissinger himself had vouched for? And here is the darkest irony of the arrangement. The very thing that made these men so valuable as a shield, their fame and their authority and their lack of scientific expertise, was the very thing that left them unable to detect the fraud. They couldn't evaluate the technology, because they didn't understand the technology. They took Holmes at her word. General Mattis, when he later testified, described her as essentially his only source for everything he knew about the company. He believed what she told him. Why wouldn't he? She was earnest and brilliant and unblinking, on a mission to help soldiers and save lives. Some of these men became genuine evangelists. Mattis, taken with the promise of quick blood testing on the battlefield, reportedly pushed to get Theranos technology explored for military use. The idea of running diagnostics for wounded soldiers in the field on a single drop of blood. As Mattis himself later testified, the reality never came close. The device was never deployed in combat, never installed on a military medevac, never used to treat a service member. But you can understand the pull for a general who'd spent his career watching troops bleed out in the field. Based on his own testimony about how much he believed in her, it's fair to say he wanted it to be real. That points to something about the whole board. On some level, they all wanted it to be real. A young woman poised to make American medicine the envy of the world, to help soldiers, to democratize healthcare, was in a sense everything these patriotic, accomplished men had spent their lives working toward. The likeliest reading of how she won them isn't that she out-argued them. She bypassed the argument entirely, appealing to their hopes and their pride and their appetite to be part of one more great American story before their time was done. She had the money. She had the legends. Now she needed someone to run the company day to day, someone loyal, someone who would enforce her will with an iron fist. She found him in the most unlikely and troubling place of all. Chapter 6. Sunny. Long before Theranos, before Stanford, when Elizabeth Holmes was just 18, she took a trip to Beijing through a Stanford program to study Mandarin. There she met a man named Ramesh Balwani. Everyone called him Sunny. Sunny Balwani was nearly 20 years older than Holmes. He was a software entrepreneur who had made a small fortune during the dot-com boom, selling a company at exactly the right moment and walking away wealthy. He was confident and aggressive and worldly. To an 18-year-old with enormous ambitions, he must have seemed impressive. A man who had already achieved the kind of success she was chasing. At some point, the relationship became romantic, and that fact would stay hidden from almost everyone connected to Theranos for years. Investors, board members, even many employees had no idea that the CEO and the man who would become the company's president and chief operating officer were, in fact, living together as a couple. A secret buried in the foundation of the company. Balwani officially joined Theranos around 2009, and the thing to understand about him is simple. He had no background in biology, no background in medicine, no background in diagnostics. His expertise was software. He'd never worked in a biotech startup, yet he was handed enormous swaths of the company, including, at various points, oversight of the very laboratory operations at the heart of everything Theranos claimed to do. He also reportedly guaranteed a substantial personal loan to the company, putting his own money on the line, binding himself financially and romantically and professionally to Holmes and her vision. Together they ran Theranos with what former employees would describe as a culture of secrecy and fear. This wasn't a freewheeling, open startup where people debated ideas. It was compartmentalized and paranoid. Different teams were kept in the dark about what other teams were doing, so that almost no one had the full picture of how badly things were going. Employees who raised concerns, who asked too many questions, who pointed out that the technology wasn't working, got marginalized, sidelined, or fired. Balwani was, by many accounts, the enforcer. Employees described him as intimidating, quick to belittle, quick to threaten. He allegedly monitored staff, controlled information, and cracked down on dissent. If Holmes was the visionary face selling the dream to the outside world, Balwani was the fist, making sure nobody on the inside broke the spell. The relationship between them was intense, and according to Holmes's own later testimony, deeply troubling. That's a claim we'll come back to at the trial, because it became one of the most explosive and contested parts of her defense. For now, hold one thing. At the center of Theranos were two people bound together in secret, running a company built on a promise that, as the evidence at their fraud trials would later establish, they had growing reason to know they couldn't keep. And they enforced that secret through fear. The promise at the center of it all, the machine, the miracle device, the thing that was supposed to justify the billions and the board and the hype, was next to nothing. Chapter 7. The Machine That Never Worked. The entire empire rested on a single revolutionary claim, that Theranos had built a machine capable of running a huge range of medical tests, dozens of them, even hundreds, using just a tiny drop of blood from a finger prick. No more big needles, no more vials drawn from your arm, no more waiting days for results. A painless prick, a few drops, a comprehensive picture of your health. The device had a name. They called it the Edison, after Thomas Edison. Later there would be a successor they called the Mini Lab. The blood was collected in a small container. Theranos branded the Nanotainer. It was a gorgeous vision. In the form Theranos sold it, it was also essentially impossible with the technology they had. Here is what the Edison was supposed to do, and why it failed. Because the science, even at a basic level, is what makes the fraud so stark. Inside the Edison, according to people who worked on it, was a robotic arm meant to do automatically what a human lab technician does by hand. Take a sample, dilute it, add the necessary chemicals and antibodies, read the result. Many of the tests it was designed to run were what scientists call immunoassays, tests that detect specific substances in the blood, like certain hormones, drugs, or disease markers. Two enormous problems are buried in that promise. The first is physical. A single drop of blood from a finger prick is a very small amount of material. Real diagnostic labs draw larger samples for a reason. You need enough blood to run a test accurately, and different tests need different components of it. Running many different tests off one tiny drop is like cooking a full banquet from a single egg. There isn't enough there. The Theranos workaround was to dilute the tiny samples, adding fluid to bump up the volume so their machines could process them. But dilution is dangerous in diagnostics. When you stretch a sample, you stretch any tiny measurement error along with it. A small inaccuracy gets amplified. The more you dilute, the less you can trust the number. That wasn't a clever innovation. It was a fundamental compromise that made the results less reliable. The second problem is worse. The Edison, for all the hype, could only actually run a small handful of the tests Theranos advertised. Estimates from former employees suggest that of the more than 200 tests the company claimed it could offer, the Edison devices were realistically being used for only about a dozen. Around 12. Out of 200 plus. So what happened to all the other tests that patients were paying for and doctors were relying on? Underneath all of it sat one ugly secret. For the vast majority of its tests, Theranos was quietly using conventional, commercially available blood testing machines made by established manufacturers like Siemens. The same machines used in ordinary labs everywhere. Not their own revolutionary technology, somebody else's standard equipment. And it got worse. Because Theranos insisted on those tiny finger prick samples, they were often diluting the blood to run it on the Siemens machines too. Machines that were never designed to work with diluted samples that way. In at least some cases, the standard machines were set to the wrong configuration. The whole operation was a jury-rigged mess, hidden behind a beautiful, sleek device and a beautiful, sleek founder. So a patient would walk into a Theranos wellness center, get a finger pricked, believe they were touching the future of medicine. In reality, their blood ran through a modified version of the same old technology, often diluted in ways that made the results unreliable, sometimes on machines set up incorrectly. The revolution was a stage set. Behind the curtain, ordinary equipment, misused. The lab where all this happened was reportedly a troubled, chaotic place. Employees described the Edison machines as unreliable in the most literal physical sense. Pieces fell off. Doors wouldn't shut. The thing couldn't hold a stable temperature. Whistleblowers described less a medical miracle than a temperamental prototype that should never have been anywhere near real patients. Then there was the office temperature itself, kept unusually cold, which former staff have suggested was to keep Holmes, in her signature layers, comfortable. A small, strange detail, and one we only have second-hand. But it lingers. Real patients' blood being processed in a chilled lab, on machines that didn't work. The most disturbing practice of all came out in the whistleblower's own testimony, and it's been described since as a kind of repeat and delete approach to data. When the machines produced test results, some of those results were obvious outliers, wildly off, clearly wrong. In legitimate science, an outlier is a warning sign, and you investigate why it happened. At Theranos, according to the sworn account of former lab associate Erica Chung, the approach was different. Quality control checks would routinely fail, and rather than stop, the company would delete the outlier data points and keep the numbers that let the tests appear to pass. Run it again, throw out what you don't like, keep what you do. That is not how science works. If you're allowed to delete the results you don't like and keep the ones you do, you can make anything look accurate. You could flip a coin 100 times, erase every tails, and announce you've invented a coin that always lands heads. That's not discovery. That's fraud dressed up as data. The people who saw this happening, the lab techs, the young scientists, some of them started to feel sick about it, because they understood something the board of generals and the billionaire investors did not. These weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real people's blood, real diagnoses that real doctors would act on. And that is where this story stops being a tale of clever business deception and becomes something genuinely dangerous. Chapter 8. The Deals That Put Lives on the Line. For years, Theranos had been a private, secretive company, a machine for raising money on the strength of a promise. But a promise doesn't make you a real business. To become the company Holmes claimed it was, Theranos needed to get its tests into the hands of actual patients. It needed retail partners, and in the chase for those partners, the fraud escalated from misleading investors to something that could hurt ordinary people. Two deals mattered most, one with the supermarket giant Safeway and one with the pharmacy chain Walgreens. Safeway came first. Its chief executive at the time, Steve Bird, was completely taken with Holmes. He later described her as genuinely charismatic and extremely smart, someone doing one of the hardest things in business, building an enterprise out of nothing. He said she owned every room she walked into. Under her spell, Safeway agreed to an enormous bet. The company would invest hundreds of millions of dollars to build blood testing clinics inside its stores. Reports put the build-out at hundreds of locations and a cost approaching $350 million or more. But the cracks showed almost immediately, and they showed in the most telling way possible. During a pitch to the Safeway board, one board member volunteered his own blood for a demonstration, a test for a prostate cancer marker. The Theranos machine reportedly made a lot of noise and then never produced a result. Holmes said something about getting it to him later. The device failed in front of the very people being asked to bet a fortune on it. When the actual pilot began, using ordinary blood draws at Safeway's corporate offices, the problems multiplied. Results that made no sense. Lost samples. Samples handled improperly. Tests that took days to come back when competitors could turn them around in one. Bird, increasingly alarmed, wrote to Holmes that he was genuinely worried Safeway's own lab reputation was getting worse by the day. Despite building out most of the planned clinics, the deal eventually fell apart. It was quietly terminated. Safeway had poured a fortune into a partnership with a technology that couldn't perform. But it was Walgreens where the danger to real patients became concrete. Because Walgreens actually opened Theranos wellness centers to the public, around 40 of them, the great majority in Arizona. Everyday people could now walk into a pharmacy, get a finger pricked, and receive medical test results from Theranos. The dream had become reality. The reality was a nightmare in the making. To land the Walgreens deal, Holmes and Theranos had, according to prosecutors and trial testimony, committed outright forgery. What happened is remarkable. Years earlier, Theranos had approached the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, hoping for a partnership. Pfizer sent a scientist named Shane Weber to evaluate the technology. Weber did his due diligence, and he was deeply unimpressed. He reported that Theranos gave evasive, unconvincing answers to technical questions, and that the conclusions in their materials simply weren't believable on the evidence provided. Pfizer declined. They wanted nothing to do with Theranos. That should have ended it. Instead, something extraordinary happened. When Theranos was courting Walgreens, the company produced a report validating its technology and stamped the Pfizer logo right on top of it, as if Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant, had reviewed and endorsed the machine. The email presenting it to Walgreens implied an official Pfizer validation. It was nothing of the kind. Pfizer had never endorsed anything. When that same Pfizer scientist was later shown the document with his company's logo on it, he testified he'd had no idea. Theranos had added the logo to manufacture the illusion of a blue-chip endorsement that had, in fact, been explicitly refused. Pfizer wasn't the only one. Prosecutors pointed to reports carrying the logos of other major pharmaceutical companies, GlaxoSmithKline and Schering-Plough, dressed up to look like independent validations. The Theranos name, the Board of Legends, the aura of inevitability, all of it short-circuited the normal instinct to check. Holmes told investors things that simply weren't true about the company's reach. She spoke of the technology being used by the military, of it being deployed in the field. Remember General Mattis and his vision of battlefield diagnostics. The reality never matched the pitch. The device was never used on a battlefield, in a medevac, or on a service member. Claims were made, to investors and partners, that the technology had been validated by outside bodies and pharmaceutical partners. It had not. Every forged logo, every inflated claim, every misleading demo pushed Theranos deeper. Because now the stakes weren't only money. Now there were 40 wellness centers where real human beings were getting real blood tests and receiving real results, generated by machines that didn't work or by standard machines fed improperly diluted blood, in a lab where inconvenient data could be deleted. The bill for all of this would eventually come due in human terms. But first, Elizabeth Holmes reached the absolute summit. Before the fall, there was the peak. And the peak was dizzying. There was another lie running underneath the fake technology and the forged endorsements. A lie about money that was, in some ways, the most brazen of all, because it meant handing sophisticated investors numbers that were pure fiction and watching them nod along. One fact reframes the rest. Investors poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Theranos, more than $700 million all told, and according to later analysis, they did it without ever seeing properly audited financial statements, no independently verified income statement, no audited balance sheet, no cash flow statement blessed by an outside accounting firm. For a company supposedly on the verge of a blockbuster public offering, that is almost incomprehensible. The most basic due diligence any first-year business student would demand simply did not happen. The Theranos aura was so strong that the investors skipped the homework. And what did Holmes tell them instead? A fairy tale of exploding revenue. Prosecutors laid it out at trial in devastating detail. In one instance, Holmes represented to an investor around 2010 that Theranos would bring in over $200 million the following year. She cited a projection of $223 million for 2011. In reality, the company's revenue was tiny and falling, dropping under $600,000. The most jaw-dropping numbers came later. Holmes told investors that Theranos, which had essentially zero revenue in 2012 and 2013, was projected to make over $100 million in 2014 and to approach $1 billion in 2015. She showed them results claiming the company had already earned roughly $100 million in 2014. The real 2014 revenue was in the neighborhood of $100,000. Not $100 million, $100,000. The claimed figure was off from reality by a factor of about 1,000, a point the SEC itself would later make when it charged the company. Holmes was telling investors the company had earned $100 million when it had earned about as much as a modestly successful small business. And she knew it. These weren't rough estimates or optimistic projections that happened not to pan out. Building a business plan on hope is not a crime. Every founder does it. This was something else. This was presenting fabricated results as fact, to induce people to part with their fortunes. The financial models she shared, prosecutors noted, were in significant part drafted with Balwani and reviewed by Holmes before she handed them to the people writing the checks. And the checks were enormous. Take the DeVos family. According to trial testimony from a representative who handled the deal, the family had initially planned to invest $50 million. After meeting Holmes in person and falling under the spell of her pitch, they doubled it to $100 million. The representative testified that they'd been shown projections of enormous revenue and had no idea the company had essentially no revenue at all. Holmes, she said, had described herself as hand-picking a small number of prominent families to grant the privilege of investing. That's the psychology at work. Not please give me money, but I am choosing a select few to let in on the greatest opportunity of the decade. Scarcity and flattery, aimed at people used to being courted. There's an even earlier warning sign that history almost forgot. Way back in the company's early years, Theranos had a chief financial officer named Henry Moseley. According to accounts of the period, Moseley discovered that Holmes was using rigged results at investor demonstrations to paper over the technology's failures. When he confronted her, when the company's own top financial officer raised the alarm, he was fired. And Holmes reportedly went years without replacing him with a true CFO, the books drifting further and further from the story she told the world. The one person whose job was to insist on financial honesty was removed the moment he insisted on it. That happened near the very beginning, which strongly suggests the deception wasn't some late-stage panic when the money got tight. On the documented record, we can reasonably conclude it was there, in some form, almost from the start. And while the investors were being fed fantasy numbers, how did Elizabeth Holmes live? The government would later note that at the height of her fraud she enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, a multi-million-dollar mansion, travel on a company-paid private jet. The money that flowed in on the strength of impossible projections funded a very real, very comfortable life at the top, even as the company beneath her generated almost nothing. So when you picture the peak that's coming next, the magazine covers, the billions, the applause, keep this underneath it. There was no real business there. $100,000 of revenue, dressed up as $100 million. A company with no audited books valued at $9 billion. A founder living like royalty on money raised, with numbers she appears to have known were false. The whole gleaming empire floated on a financial illusion, as hollow as the machine at its center. Chapter 9. The Peak. Queen of Silicon Valley. Around 2013 and 2014, Theranos came out of the shadows, and Elizabeth Holmes became a superstar. Not a business world superstar, a genuine mainstream household name superstar. And the speed and totality of the climb is hard to overstate. The business press led the charge. A major Fortune feature put her on the cover under a headline about the chief executive who was, as they put it, out for blood, introducing this striking young founder and her revolutionary company to a huge audience. Forbes followed. The New Yorker ran a long, serious profile on her drive to revolutionize medical testing. Suddenly Elizabeth Holmes was everywhere. The numbers were staggering. On the strength of its fundraising, Theranos reached a valuation of around $9 billion. Holmes owned roughly half the company, which put her, on paper, at around $4.5 billion. Forbes crowned her the youngest self-made female billionaire in the United States. She wasn't just successful, she was historic. The honors piled up. Time named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and the tribute in that issue was written by none other than Henry Kissinger, her own board member, praising her vision and her character. She gave a widely viewed TED-Med talk. She spoke at prestigious forums beside the most important people in business and politics. Her orbit touched presidents and vice presidents and the great and powerful of the age. She launched initiatives to bring more women into science and technology. She became a symbol, and that word, symbol, is the key. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't just a founder anymore. She had become a story the whole culture wanted to tell itself. In a Silicon Valley long criticized as a boys' club, here was a brilliant young woman poised to dominate an industry, promising to democratize healthcare and save lives. She was inspirational. She was aspirational. She let a whole generation believe the tech revolution could be noble, could be humane, could wear a woman's face and a healer's mission. The media wanted her to be real. Investors wanted her to be real. Her board of statesmen wanted her to be real. Young women looking for a role model wanted her to be real. She had, quite brilliantly, made herself into a figure that huge numbers of powerful people had a vested interest in not scrutinizing too closely. To doubt Elizabeth Holmes was to doubt a beautiful dream about the future. She'd reached the very top. Billions in valuation, the most illustrious board in corporate history, the adoration of the press, the trust of some of the richest families in the world, wellness centers open to the public, a face on magazine covers around the globe. There was only one problem with standing at the top of a mountain built on a lie. There is nowhere to go but down, and the ground was already cracking. Inside the company, A handful of young people had seen what was really happening in that freezing lab, and they were about to do the one thing Elizabeth Holmes had never planned for. They were going to tell the truth. Before we get to the people who tore it all down, it's worth seeing how high the deception climbed. Because it didn't stop at billionaires and generals. Elizabeth Holmes charmed her way into the very center of American political power. Presidents, vice presidents, and first families lined up to celebrate her. And the single most revealing episode in that whole courtship shows, better than almost anything else in the story, exactly how the trick worked. By 2015, Holmes wasn't just a business celebrity. She'd become a political darling, embraced across party lines in a way almost no entrepreneur ever manages. President Barack Obama named her a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship, an official honor, a title from the White House itself, positioning her as a face of American innovation to the world. She dined at the White House. Harvard Medical School invited her onto its prestigious Board of Fellows, a stunning honor for a woman with no medical degree, running a company whose technology no independent scientist had ever verified. On the other side of the aisle, she got close to the Clinton orbit. Former President Bill Clinton interviewed her on stage at his Clinton Global Initiative, sharing a panel with her and one of the world's most famous business figures. She appeared at Clinton Foundation events and even campaigned alongside members of the Clinton family. Republicans on her board, Democrats on the stage beside her. Elizabeth Holmes had pulled off the rarest thing in American public life. She was a hero to everyone. Then came the visit that says it all. In July of 2015, the sitting Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, toured a Theranos facility in Newark, California. This was the big time. The Vice President, walking the halls of Elizabeth Holmes's company, there to bless it as the future of American medicine. Biden was effusive. After the tour, he praised Theranos publicly, calling it the laboratory of the future. You could see what innovation was all about just by walking through the place, he said. He tied it to his own passion for preventive health care, a golden moment. The imprimatur of the White House itself, captured on camera, broadcast to the world. What better validation could a company receive? Except, according to a former Theranos employee, the lab Joe Biden toured that day was, in her word, completely fake. The account comes from the company's own former chief design architect, Anna Ariola. The gleaming facility the vice president walked through, the demonstration of American innovation, had been staged specifically for his visit. The story former employees told is almost surreal. Ahead of Biden's arrival, part-time clinical staff were reportedly told not to come in that day. A room, reportedly a microbiology office, was cleared out, given a fresh coat of paint, and stocked with rows and rows of Edison machines, gathered from wherever they could be found, arranged to look like a humming, high-tech manufacturing floor. One former employee even recalled fans set up in a doorway, not for the machines, but to blow away the smell of the fresh paint before the vice president walked in. The vice president of the United States stood in a set, a stage dressed to look like the future of medicine, populated by devices that couldn't reliably do what the company claimed, in a lab reconfigured overnight to fool him. And he walked away inspired, praising it to the nation, lending the full prestige of his office to a mirage. The whole Theranos phenomenon lives in that single image. A Potemkin laboratory, freshly painted, fans running to hide the smell, machines stacked as props, and the most powerful people in the country nodding along, seeing exactly what they wanted to see, telling the world it was real. And the episode reveals her method plainly. The likeliest explanation for how she operated is that she'd grasped what most people miss. Those at the top rarely check for themselves. They arrive, they're impressed, they endorse, they move on to the next thing. The higher you climb, the more your presence becomes a kind of performance, and the less anyone expects you to inspect the plumbing. Whether or not she thought of it in those exact terms, the pattern is unmistakable. Holmes gave the powerful a beautiful show, and the powerful gave her their credibility in return. It was a trade, and for years everyone involved seems to have believed they got the better end of it. The politicians distanced themselves later, once the truth came out, as anyone would. But the footage remains, the praise remains, the honors stay in the record. For one shining stretch, Elizabeth Holmes had convinced not just Silicon Valley, not just Wall Street, but Washington itself. Left, right, and center, the whole American establishment, applauding a lie in a freshly painted room. And the only people who could stop it were a handful of young employees earning a fraction of what her board members made. The people who actually had to run the machines, and who knew they didn't work. Chapter 10. The Whistleblowers. Elizabeth Holmes had built a fortress of credibility. The generals, the billionaires, the magazine covers, all of it made Theranos seem untouchable. But every fortress has a weak point, and the weak point of Theranos was the same as its strength. It employed real scientists and real technicians, real people with consciences, who could see with their own eyes that the emperor had no clothes. Two of them would change everything: Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung. Start with Tyler Schultz, because his story carries a twist so improbable it sounds like fiction. Tyler was a young Stanford graduate in his early 20s, full of idealism, who came to work at Theranos genuinely inspired by Holmes's vision. And he had a very particular connection to the company. His grandfather was George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, the very man who had brought all those legends onto the board. Holmes's most important early champion. So when Tyler started noticing that things at Theranos were badly wrong, the data manipulation, the deletion of inconvenient results, the failures of the Edison machine, the culture of hiding problems rather than solving them, he was caught in an almost unbearable position. He was watching his employer commit what looked like fraud, and his own grandfather, a man he loved and admired, was one of the company's most prominent public believers. Tyler worked closely with another young employee, a lab associate named Erica Chung. She too had joined out of genuine excitement about the mission, and she too quickly found the ugly truth. She watched outlier results, data that showed the machine's failing quality control checks, get thrown out so the tests could appear to pass. She saw the repeat and delete approach in action. At one point she reportedly had her own blood tested on a Theranos machine and got a result that conventional testing contradicted. When the machine was tested on her, it was wrong. Both faced a genuine moral crisis. They could do what most people do: keep their heads down, collect their paychecks, move on. That was exactly what Tyler's own parents advised: to quietly quit and get on with his life. Nobody would have blamed them. Fighting a $9 billion company backed by Henry Kissinger and a former Secretary of Defense was, on its face, insane. But they couldn't let it go because they understood the stakes. This wasn't a faulty app. This was people's blood, people's diagnoses, people's health decisions. Tyler first tried to do it the right way, from the inside. He raised his concerns internally. He even took them to the top, voicing his doubts to Holmes herself. It went nowhere. Instead of gratitude, he got hostility. Balwani, the company's president, reportedly answered his concerns with belittling contempt. The message was clear: shut up or leave. So Tyler resigned. And then he did something braver. Using an alias, he reported Theranos to state health regulators in New York, flagging the failures in its testing procedures. And he became a confidential source for a reporter who had started sniffing around the company, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal named John Carreyrou. To protect himself, Tyler reportedly bought a burner phone with cash so he could speak to the reporter without being traced. Erica Chung took her own courageous step. She filed a complaint with the federal agency overseeing clinical labs, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that would eventually help trigger a surprise inspection of the Theranos lab. What did these two young people get in return for their courage? They became the targets of one of the most aggressive intimidation campaigns imaginable. Theranos, armed with a fortune and represented by the famous, ferocious attorney David Boies, came after them with everything it had. Tyler faced a barrage of legal threats, accusations that he'd leaked trade secrets, demands that he sign documents recanting what he knew. He would ultimately rack up something like $500,000 in legal fees just defending himself, a devastating sum for a young man just out of college. His father was terrified for him, reportedly warning him that he had no idea how much money these people had, who was on their board, how much they loved to sue. Both Tyler and Erica believed they were being followed by private investigators. Chung described a chilling experience. Someone lurking in her workplace parking lot, and then a letter arriving at a temporary address she'd barely given to anyone. She's spoken about the fear of it, the sleepless nights. Tyler testified that a private investigator tailed him. Holmes reportedly even hired an opposition research firm to dig into Carey himself. And then there was the almost Shakespearean tragedy at the center of Tyler's ordeal. His grandfather, George Schultz, did not believe him. Holmes had told the elder Schultz that Theranos went above and beyond every regulatory standard. George believed Holmes over his own grandson. He told Tyler, in effect, that he thought Tyler was wrong. Tyler was 22 years old, certain he was telling the truth about something dangerous, and his own grandfather, a legendary man of integrity, sided with the person committing the fraud. At one point, Tyler agreed to meet at his grandfather's home on the condition that no lawyers would be there. When he arrived, Theranos lawyers were waiting, and he was in effect ambushed with legal documents. His grandfather was reportedly uncomfortable with how harshly the lawyers treated Tyler, but he kept believing Holmes. One detail captures the whole delusion. Tyler's step-grandmother reportedly received a Theranos test showing a potassium level so high that, if real, it would have been a medical emergency. The lab told her to go straight to the ER. She redid the test conventionally. It was normal. When she questioned it, Holmes reportedly explained it away by suggesting she'd eaten too many green beans. The step-grandmother didn't buy that absurd excuse, but George Schultz did. And by every account of his conduct in those years, the most plausible reading is that he wanted to believe so badly he'd take an explanation about green beans over the plain evidence in front of him. That is the power of the spell Elizabeth Holmes cast. It could make a brilliant statesman doubt his own flesh and blood, but there was one thing the spell couldn't touch. The truth doesn't care how many generals sit on your board, and a reporter with the truth in his hands was about to publish. Chapter 11. The Story That Brought Down an Empire. John Carey was an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner with a nose for corporate deception. Around 2015, a tip reached him about Theranos, a company being celebrated everywhere as a world-changing miracle. Something about it didn't add up. The claims were extraordinary, the technology was shrouded in secrecy, and the science, as far as anyone could tell, didn't quite make sense. Carey started digging, thanks to sources like Tyler Schultz, Erica Chung, and a former Theranos lab director named Adam Rosendorf, people who'd seen the truth from the inside. He began to assemble the real picture. Not the picture on the magazine covers. A company whose flagship device barely worked, that secretly ran most of its tests on standard commercial machines, that diluted samples in questionable ways, that manipulated its data, and that was putting unreliable results in front of real patients. Theranos knew he was coming, and the company fought back with ferocity. It deployed lawyers. It leaned on sources. It tried to intimidate the whistleblowers into silence, and to pressure the newspaper into killing the story. Holmes reportedly went to the Wall Street Journal directly, using her charm and her powerful connections to try to head off publication. Rupert Murdoch, remember, was both a major Theranos investor and the owner of the very newspaper about to expose the company, a staggering conflict of interest. And yet, to his credit, Murdoch reportedly declined to interfere with his journalist's work, even though it meant watching an investment worth over $100 million get destroyed by his own reporter. In October of 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carey story on its front page. It landed like a grenade. The reporting laid it out. Theranos was running only a small fraction of its tests on its proprietary Edison technology. The overwhelming majority were being done on conventional, off-the-shelf machines. There were serious questions about the accuracy of the results. Former employees described a company that had been dressing up ordinary, sometimes compromised testing as a revolution. The dam broke. Once the journal had said out loud what so many had been afraid to say, the questions came flooding from every direction. Regulators, who had been strangely hands-off, began to scrutinize. The timing lined up with the complaints the whistleblowers had already filed. A surprise federal inspection of the Theranos lab was in motion, and what regulators found there would be catastrophic for the company. Holmes did what she'd always done. She went on television, on financial news, in her black turtleneck and her deep voice, and she denied everything. She framed the journal's reporting as the story of a threatened old guard trying to tear down an innovator. She fought. She projected total confidence. But confidence is not the same as truth, and the machinery of accountability, once it starts turning, cannot be charmed to a halt. Chapter 12. The Collapse. Once the truth was out, the fall of Theranos was breathtakingly fast. A company that had taken more than a decade to build its towering $9 billion illusion came apart in a matter of months. The federal regulators who inspected the lab, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, found serious, dangerous problems: deficiencies in equipment, failures in quality control, practices that put patient health at risk. Inspectors ultimately concluded the lab posed an immediate jeopardy to patient safety. The agency moved to ban Holmes from the blood testing industry and revoke the lab's federal license. The Food and Drug Administration weighed in too, scrutinizing the little nanotainer blood collection container and, in its findings, describing it as an uncleared medical device. Theranos was ordered to stop using its proprietary collection method for most of its tests. Then came the decision that laid bare how untrustworthy the whole operation had been. Theranos was forced to void an enormous number of its test results, 2 entire years' worth from its Edison machines, spanning 2014 and 2015. That meant sending out tens of thousands of corrected reports to patients and their doctors. Tens of thousands. Every one of them a moment where a real person might have made a real medical decision based on a number the company now admitted it couldn't stand behind. The business partnerships evaporated. Walgreens, which had opened those 40 wellness centers to the public, pulled out and shut down every location. Later, it would sue Theranos over the money it had invested. Safeway's deal was already dead. The retail dream, the whole path to actual patients, was gone. The money vanished too. Forbes, which had once crowned Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire with a personal fortune of $4.5 billion, looked again at the reality and revised its estimate of her net worth to a single number: 0. The magazine also cut its valuation of the company itself from $9 billion to a small fraction of that. On paper, in a stroke, one of the richest self-made women in America became worth nothing. Sunny Balwani left the company in 2016, stepping down as president. His relationship with Holmes, professional and personal, was ending along with the company they'd built. Holmes made one last desperate attempt to save the dream. In 2016, she appeared at a scientific conference to unveil a new device, the Mini Lab, hoping to reset the narrative and present Theranos as a real technology company after all. By then, the credibility was gone. The scientific community was skeptical and unmoved. You cannot re-earn trust from a stage when the foundation of everything you've claimed has already crumbled. The layoffs came in waves. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs as the company shut down its labs and wellness centers. And finally, in 2018, Theranos ceased operations and was dissolved. The company, valued at $9 billion, that had assembled the most illustrious board in corporate history, that had promised to change the world, was simply gone. Investors who'd poured in hundreds of millions collectively lost it all. The Waltons, Murdoch, the DeVos family, Carlos Slim, their money evaporated into the void of a promise that was never real. But the collapse of a company is a financial event. What Theranos did to actual human beings was something else. And before we follow Elizabeth Holmes into the courtroom, we have to stop with the people who paid the highest price of all, measured not in dollars but in fear. Chapter 13. The Human Cost. It's easy, with a story like this, to get swept up in the spectacle. The billions, the celebrity board, the audacious lies, the dramatic downfall. Strip all that away, and at the center of the Theranos fraud sits something simpler and darker. Real patients, trusting real doctors, got test results that were wrong. And some of those wrong results told people terrifying things about their own bodies. When Theranos put its unreliable tests in front of the public through those Walgreens wellness centers, the machine wasn't producing statistics. It was producing verdicts on people's health. And when it got one wrong, the consequences landed on human beings who'd done nothing but trust a company the whole country was celebrating. The errors cut two ways. A test result is only useful if it's accurate. A false negative, telling someone they're fine when they're not, can push a person to skip treatment they urgently need, letting a real illness run unchecked. A false positive, telling someone they're sick when they're not, can send them spiraling into fear, into invasive follow-up procedures, onto medications with real side effects, through psychological anguish that lingers long after the mistake is corrected. Theranos produced both kinds, and some of the individual stories that surfaced are genuinely heartbreaking. One patient received a Theranos result indicating she was HIV positive, a result that further testing disproved. The terror of that news is easy to summon. The sleepless nights, the fear for a future that suddenly looks unrecognizable, all of it set off by a machine that didn't work. Another woman had already suffered through multiple miscarriages. She was pregnant again and understandably anxious, and she received Theranos results during her pregnancy, suggesting she'd lost the baby once more. That devastating result was wrong. She went on to give birth to a healthy child, but she was made to grieve a loss that hadn't happened, put through emotional torture by a false reading. Court testimony surfaced other cases. Patients whose results falsely suggested serious conditions. Doctors making decisions based on numbers that were simply untrue. And behind each documented story lie an unknown number of others. People who got a bad number, worried, retested, and quietly moved on. People who maybe changed a medication, or delayed care, or spent weeks in fear, never fully knowing the source of their distress was a fraud. Tyler Schultz once made a chilling point about the inevitability of all of it. Even without the reporters and regulators, he said, Theranos would have unraveled eventually, because people were getting false results. His observation was simple and haunting. Patients were being harmed, and sooner or later someone was going to sound the alarm. The damage would become impossible to hide. That's why the Theranos story is more than a business scandal. That's why it matters in a way a mere financial fraud never could. Elizabeth Holmes didn't just take money from people who could afford to lose it. She built a company that fed false information into the most intimate and consequential decisions human beings make, decisions about their own bodies and their own survival. And she did it while wrapped in the credibility of generals and statesmen and magazine covers, so that the very people being endangered had every reason to trust her. The reckoning for all of it was coming, and it would play out in a federal courtroom, in front of the whole world. Chapter 14. The Reckoning Begins. The unwinding of Elizabeth Holmes moved from the business pages to the justice system in stages, each one tightening the noose. First came the civil regulators. In March of 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the agency that polices fraud in the financial markets, charged Holmes, Balwani, and Theranos with what it called massive fraud. The SEC's account was blunt. Holmes and Balwani had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long scheme built on exaggerated and false statements about the company's technology, its business, and its finances. The story they'd told investors bore little resemblance to reality. Holmes settled those civil charges. She agreed to pay a $500,000 penalty, to surrender voting control and return 18.9 million shares, and, significantly, to accept a ban on serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. In settling, she did not formally admit or deny the allegations, which is common in such settlements. But the message was unmistakable. The federal government had officially branded Theranos a fraud. The civil case was only the appetizer. Fraud on this scale, fraud that had taken hundreds of millions from investors, invites a far more serious kind of attention. In June of 2018, a federal grand jury handed down criminal indictments against both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. Multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, not fines and settlements charges, the kind that send people to prison for years. The allegations covered two broad schemes: defrauding the investors who'd poured money into Theranos, and defrauding the doctors and patients who'd relied on its tests. The stakes were now existential. Holmes was facing the possibility of decades behind bars. In the lead-up to trial, the public got to see something striking. Video from depositions Holmes had given to the SEC back in 2017, first broadcast by ABC in 2019, confronted again and again with specific questions about her company's technology and her statements to investors. Holmes answered with some version of, "I don't know," an astonishing number of times. By ABC's count, more than 600. The confident visionary who'd always had an answer, who'd spoken with such certainty about revolutionizing medicine, suddenly couldn't seem to recall the details of her own empire. Both Holmes and Balwani pleaded not guilty. The stage was set for one of the most closely watched fraud trials in Silicon Valley history. The two former partners would be tried separately, and Holmes's defense strategy, when it finally emerged, would shock even the people who'd followed the case closely for years. Chapter 15. The Trial. Elizabeth Holmes's criminal trial got underway in 2021 in a federal courthouse in San Jose, California. The beating heart of Silicon Valley, a fitting place for the reckoning of one of its most notorious creations. The trial had been delayed several times, including by the surge of the COVID-19 pandemic and by Holmes's pregnancy. But now, at last, the government would lay out its case, and Elizabeth Holmes would answer for it. The prosecution's story was straightforward at its core. Holmes knew Theranos' technology did not work as she claimed, and she lied, to investors and partners, to keep the money flowing and the dream alive. To prove it, they called a parade of witnesses, each adding a brick to the wall. They called Shane Weber, the Pfizer scientist, who testified about how his company had evaluated Theranos and declined to partner, and how his skeptical report had later been dressed up with a Pfizer logo it was never meant to carry. They called executives from the retail partners, like former Safeway chief executive Steve Bird, who described being charmed by Holmes and then dismayed by the failures, the demo that never produced a result, the nonsensical numbers, the mounting worry. They called former lab director Adam Rosendorf, one of the whistleblower sources, who testified about the pressure inside the company to release results he wasn't confident in, and the gap between what Theranos claimed and what it could deliver. They called Erica Chung, the young lab associate, who described from the stand what she'd witnessed. The deletion of outlier data, the failing quality control checks, the machines that couldn't be trusted. They called patients and doctors, who testified about the wrong results and the harm and fear they caused. And they called board member General James Mattis. The retired general, who'd gone on to serve as Secretary of Defense, took the stand and described how Holmes had been his primary source of information about the company, how he'd trusted her, how what she'd presented to the board didn't match the reality. One of the most powerful men in America, testifying to how thoroughly he'd been misled by a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. The documentary evidence was damning too. Text messages and emails between Holmes and Balwani discussing the company's problems, the forged reports, the internal knowledge of failures that stood in stark contrast to the glowing public claims. The prosecution's goal was to make one thing crystal clear. This was not an honest founder whose startup happened to fail. Startups fail all the time, and that's no crime. This was someone who knew, and who lied anyway. Then came the twist almost no one expected. Elizabeth Holmes took the stand in her own defense. Most defendants in fraud trials don't testify. The risk of cross-examination is enormous. But Holmes, ever the believer in her own persuasive power, chose to face the jury directly. Over roughly 7 days of testimony, she told her side. And part of that side was an accusation of a very personal and very serious nature. Holmes testified that her former partner, Sunny Balwani, the man nearly 20 years her senior, whom she'd met at 18, had subjected her to years of psychological and sexual abuse. She described a relationship in which, she said, he sought to control her diet, her contacts with family, her decisions at work. She also testified that she'd been raped as a student at Stanford and that the trauma had been part of what drove her to throw herself completely into building Theranos. The clear thrust of the defense was that Holmes had been under the sway of a controlling, abusive partner, that her judgment and her actions had been shaped by that dynamic. Balwani, through his representatives, strenuously denied these allegations. These were grave claims, and they deserved to be treated with seriousness rather than spectacle. They were also, legally, part of a strategy, an attempt to help the jury see Holmes, not as a cold mastermind, but as a young woman caught in something larger and darker than herself. But the prosecution pushed back hard on the idea that Holmes was a passive figure who didn't know what was happening in her own company. Under cross-examination, she was confronted with the evidence of her own knowledge and her own choices. She had to acknowledge uncomfortable facts, including adding that Pfizer logo to the report, which she said she regretted. She was pressed on the false claims about military use, which she tried to cast as misunderstandings. She had to confront communications that suggested she was well aware of the problems even as she projected total confidence outward. Whatever her personal circumstances, the prosecution argued, Elizabeth Holmes was the chief executive, she was in charge, and she knew. After a long trial and days of deliberation, in January of 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. And it was a split decision, nuanced and revealing. The jury found Elizabeth Holmes guilty on 4 counts related to defrauding investors, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors, and 3 counts of wire fraud tied to specific investments, involving well over $100 million. On 4 counts related to defrauding patients, the jury found her not guilty. A 5th patient-related wire fraud count had been dismissed during the trial. On 3 additional investor counts, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. They deadlocked. That split says something about how juries think. They were convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Holmes had defrauded the sophisticated investors who put money into her company. On the charges of defrauding patients, they didn't convict, perhaps because the chain of intent connecting Holmes personally to specific patient harm was harder to prove to a legal certainty. Either way, the core finding stood. Elizabeth Holmes was a convicted fraudster, guilty of deceiving the investors who'd believed in her. Sunny Balwani faced his own separate trial later. His jury was even less forgiving. Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts he faced, a broader conviction than Holmes's, including counts related to defrauding patients as well as investors. The 2 people at the center of Theranos, once partners in business and in life, were now both convicted felons, awaiting sentencing. The dream wasn't just dead. It had been declared, by the justice system of the United States, a crime. Chapter 16. Sentencing, Prison, and the Long Aftermath. With the conviction secured, the final question was punishment. In November of 2022, Elizabeth Holmes returned to that San Jose courtroom to learn her fate. There'd been a strange, dramatic wrinkle beforehand. One of the key witnesses against her, former lab director Adam Rosendorf, had shown up at Holmes's home in August 2022, where he spoke with her partner, Billy Evans, in what her lawyers characterized as an expression of regret about the role his testimony had played. Holmes's defense seized on it and filed for a new trial. But when Rosendorf was called back to the stand at an October hearing, he reaffirmed the truthfulness of his testimony, said the government hadn't pressured him, and made clear he did not want to help Holmes. The judge denied the new trial motion. The judge, Edward Davila, sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 135 months in federal prison, 11 years and 3 months. For a woman who'd once been worth billions and celebrated as a visionary, it was a staggering fall. She was also ordered, along with Balwani, to pay roughly $452 million in restitution to the investors they'd defrauded, a sum she has essentially no realistic way of ever fully paying. By the time of sentencing, Holmes's personal life had transformed. During the years of investigation and trial, she'd begun a relationship with Billy Evans, an heir connected to a hospitality business. The two became partners and had children together, a son born in 2021, shortly before her trial, and a daughter born in 2023. She would be leaving young children behind when she went to prison. On May 30, 2023, Elizabeth Holmes reported to Federal Prison Camp Bryan, a minimum security women's facility in Bryan, Texas, a low-security camp housing several hundred women, about 100 miles northwest of Houston. It was about as far as you could get from the glittering forums and magazine covers of her peak. The youngest self-made female billionaire in American history was now a federal inmate. Around the time she was heading to prison, a remarkable magazine profile appeared. A journalist had spent time with Holmes and her family, and the portrait that emerged was of a very different person from the icon the public remembered. A relaxed mother, a softer presence, and, tellingly, a normal speaking voice. The reporter noted that in person, Holmes spoke in an unremarkable tone, none of that famous deep, throaty register she'd used while running Theranos. In a way, it was the final confirmation of what people had long suspected. The voice had been a costume all along. But the story didn't end at the prison gates. Because Elizabeth Holmes has never stopped fighting, and the legal and public sagas have kept unfolding. Holmes appealed her conviction, arguing that the trial judge had made significant legal errors, including by letting former Theranos employees give testimony her lawyers said crossed into improper expert opinion. On February 24, 2025, a three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected those arguments and affirmed her conviction, her sentence, and the $452 million restitution order in full. Balwani's conviction was upheld in the same ruling. Holmes petitioned for a rehearing, and that petition was denied in May 2025. Then, in December 2025, the court issued an amended opinion that once again affirmed her conviction, sentence, and restitution. The conviction stood. Then, in a development that surprised many observers, her sentence was reduced. In March 2026, Judge Davila cut 12 months off her prison term, trimming it from 135 months, 11 years and 3 months, to 123 months, 10 years and 3 months. He did it under a 2023 amendment to the federal sentencing guidelines that offers leniency to first-time, nonviolent offenders, and he made a notable finding along the way. The prosecution had not proven that any individual Theranos investor suffered the kind of substantial financial hardship that would have disqualified her. The investors, he noted, had signed paperwork affirming they could absorb a total loss. Federal prosecutors had opposed the reduction, arguing that Holmes still posed a risk to reoffend, pointing among other things to her continued interest in healthcare technology even after everything that had happened. And that continued interest is real, one of the more astonishing footnotes to the whole saga. Even as Holmes sat in prison, her partner Billy Evans was reported to be raising money for a new blood testing startup called Hemanthus, Greek for blood flower, a diagnostics venture using light-based analysis known as Raman spectroscopy. It immediately drew comparisons to Theranos. The company publicly insisted it was not Theranos 2.0 and stated that Holmes holds no formal role, though multiple reports, citing sources close to the venture, said she's been advising Evans from behind bars. The instinct that built Theranos did not simply vanish. Holmes herself has said in interviews from prison that she intends to return to healthcare and has been drafting patents for new inventions. Holmes has also pursued the ultimate escape route, clemency. In 2025, she filed a request with the Department of Justice, formally asking President Donald Trump to commute her sentence. Her petition landed in a political climate where the president had granted clemency to a number of people convicted of financial and white-collar crimes, among them the crypto executive Changpeng Zhao and former Representative George Santos. As of the most recent public reporting in mid-2026, the Office of the Pardon Attorney still listed her petition as pending, with no public sign that the president had acted on it either way. These situations move fast, so the current status is one to check against the latest news. So that is where the story of Elizabeth Holmes rests, for the moment. A convicted fraudster serving out a reduced sentence in a Texas prison camp, a mother of two, a woman still remarkably connected to the world of blood diagnostics that made and destroyed her, still, by some accounts, believing in some version of the dream. But the deepest question this story leaves us with isn't about Elizabeth Holmes at all. It's about everyone else. Here's something that would have been unimaginable at the peak of her fame. Elizabeth Holmes has become one of the most chronicled fraudsters in modern history. The story she worked so hard to control, the one she once fed to fawning magazines, slipped entirely out of her grasp and became a cultural phenomenon, told and retold across nearly every medium we have. And understanding that afterlife is part of understanding why the story matters so much. It began with the reporter. John Carreyrou, whose front-page investigation cracked the whole thing open, kept pulling the thread after the newspaper articles ran. He turned his years of reporting into a book called Bad Blood, a meticulous, gripping account of the rise and fall of Theranos, built on interviews with dozens of insiders and a mountain of documents. It became a bestseller, and it's now widely regarded as the definitive telling, the book that laid out, chapter by chapter, exactly how the fraud worked and how it was exposed. It's the kind of reporting that reminds you why serious journalism matters. Without it, the powerful people Holmes had fooled had every incentive to keep the truth buried. Then came the audio, a podcast called The Dropout, produced by ABC News and hosted by the journalist Rebecca Jarvis, dug into Holmes's life and the Theranos collapse, weaving in interviews and actual deposition tapes, including that infamous footage of Holmes answering with endless variations of, "I don't know." Hearing her own voice, evasive and flat, did something the written word couldn't. It made the deception audible. Then came the documentary. HBO released The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, a film that used real footage and insider testimony to chart the whole arc, the soaring promises, the true believers, the machines that didn't work. Watching Holmes on screen, delivering her lines with that hypnotic certainty, audiences could see the spell for themselves. Then came the dramatization. Holmes's story was adapted into a scripted television series, also called The Dropout, with the actress Amanda Seyfried taking on the daunting role of Elizabeth Holmes. The voice, the stare, the turtlenecks, the whole constructed persona. Seyfried's performance was widely praised and earned major recognition, including a Primetime Emmy Award, cementing Holmes as one of those rare real-life figures who become, almost against their will, a defining dramatic character of their era. There was even for a time a major Hollywood film in the works, with an A-list star attached to play Holmes in a movie adaptation of Carrie Rue's book, though that particular project was eventually shelved. But the point stands. Elizabeth Holmes has been the subject of a best-selling book, chart-topping podcasts, a prestige documentary, and an award-winning television series. Her face, her voice, her story gets studied in business schools and ethics classes around the world as the textbook case of Silicon Valley fraud. There's a bitter irony in that. Elizabeth Holmes spent her whole career obsessed with building a legacy, with restoring her family's lost greatness, with becoming a name history would remember. And she got exactly what she wanted. She is a name history will remember. Just not for the reasons she intended. She wanted to be the next Steve Jobs. She became the definitive cautionary tale, the woman whose name is now shorthand for the beautiful, dangerous lie. Her story endures because it isn't really about blood tests, or Silicon Valley, or even about her. It endures because it holds up a mirror. It asks each of us an uncomfortable question. If we'd been in that room, seeing the confident young founder, the celebrity board, the presidential praise, the glowing covers, would we have been the skeptic who asked the hard question, or would we have been one more person nodding along, wanting so badly to believe? Most of us would have believed. That's what makes the story immortal. Chapter 17. Why It Worked. We've walked the whole rise and fall, but the most important question has been circling the whole time. Not what happened, but why it was possible. How does one young woman, with no working product and almost no scientific expertise, fool so many powerful, intelligent, sophisticated people for so long? That's the truly astonishing part. Anyone can tell a lie. The genius and the horror of the Theranos story is in how many brilliant people believed it, defended it, staked their reputations and fortunes on it, and attacked the truth-tellers who tried to stop it. Understanding why is the whole point, because the conditions that produced Elizabeth Holmes have not gone away. Start with the culture she operated in. Silicon Valley runs on a particular gospel, often boiled down to a phrase, "Fake it till you make it." Founders should project a vision of a future that doesn't exist yet, then race to make it real before the money runs out. In a sense, that's how a lot of legitimate technology gets built. You promise something ambitious, you raise money on the promise, and you deliver. The trouble is that the line between visionary optimism and outright fraud is blurrier than anyone in that world likes to admit. Holmes took the accepted practice of overpromising and pushed it into forged documents and falsified medical results. But she started on a spectrum the whole industry lives on. An extreme point on a curve, not a creature from another planet. Then there's the specific machinery of credibility she built, which we can now see clearly as a system. Each part reinforced the others. The famous board gave her legitimacy. The legitimacy pulled in famous investors. The famous investors pulled in glowing press. The glowing press pulled in more investors and partners. Every layer made the next layer easier and made scrutiny harder. Who wants to be the skeptic publicly doubting a company blessed by Henry Kissinger, funded by the Waltons, and celebrated on the cover of Fortune? The social cost of doubting her grew enormous, while the social reward for believing her, for being an early champion of the next Steve Jobs, was intoxicating. There's also the vulnerability she exploited in her board and her investors. She surrounded herself with powerful people who were powerful in the wrong domains. Diplomats and generals and bankers are formidable in diplomacy and war and finance. Not one of them could evaluate an immunoassay. She built a fortress of authority out of people who, by design, couldn't check her central claim. Their expertise was real. It was also irrelevant to the one question that mattered. Does the machine work? Because they couldn't answer it themselves, they did what all of us do in the face of things we don't understand. They trusted the confident expert in front of them. She was their expert. She was the only one in the room who claimed to know. And there's the uncomfortable role of the story we all wanted to be true. Holmes offered a narrative that flattered everyone who bought into it. Investors got to feel like visionaries backing a world changer. The elder statesman got to feel part of one more great American achievement. The media got an irresistible protagonist, young and female and brilliant and mission-driven, in an industry that badly needed one. A whole culture wanted a healer genius in a black turtleneck, and Holmes shaped herself into exactly the figure people were hungry to celebrate. When a lie tells people what they want to hear about themselves and their world, they become co-authors of it. They defend it, because exposing it would mean exposing their own credulity. There's a thornier dimension worth naming honestly, because it cuts more than one way. Elizabeth Holmes was a young woman in an industry overwhelmingly dominated by men, and that fact was central to her rise. Silicon Valley was hungry, genuinely and understandably hungry, for a female founder who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Jobses and Gateses and Zuckerbergs. She filled a vacuum the culture desperately wanted filled, and that hunger made people root for her, feature her, invest in her, and hesitate to attack her. Some observers have argued her gender may even have shielded her for a time, that skeptics worried how it would look to tear down the most prominent woman in tech. Holmes herself, in her defense, leaned into a narrative of a young woman shaped by an older, controlling man. These are genuinely difficult threads to untangle, and reasonable people weigh them differently. But here's the point that matters most, and it's one many women in technology have made pointedly themselves. The lesson of Elizabeth Holmes is not that we should trust female founders less. It's that we should apply the same rigor to everyone. The impulse to suspend scrutiny for a compelling figure, whoever they are, is exactly the vulnerability a fraudster exploits. Holmes didn't only take advantage of greed and vanity. She took advantage of good intentions, of a whole industry's genuine desire to celebrate someone like her. That may be the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Our hopes can be turned into weapons against us. And we can't ignore the failures of the systems that were supposed to catch this. Regulators were, for years, strangely hands-off. There were gaps in how certain medical tests were overseen, loopholes that let lab-developed tests reach patients without the rigorous pre-market review most medical devices require. Theranos slipped through those gaps, hiding behind claims of trade secrets, treating the machinery of accountability as an obstacle to evade, rather than a safeguard to respect. For many, the Theranos affair became a wake-up call about those blind spots, a demonstration of how much damage can be done in the space between what companies claim and what anyone actually verifies. But here's the part of the why that should give us the most hope and the most homework. In the end, the fortress fell. It didn't fall to the SEC, or the FDA, or the powerful board, or the sophisticated investors. It fell because a handful of ordinary people refused to look away. A lab associate in her 20s, who filed a complaint. A young man who bought a burner phone and defied his own legendary grandfather and $500,000 in legal fees to tell a reporter the truth. A former lab director who spoke honestly about what he'd seen. A stubborn journalist who kept digging while the whole world was busy celebrating. They had no armies, no cabinet titles, no billions. They had the truth and the courage to say it out loud while powerful people tried to frighten them into silence. That's the real lesson buried in the Theranos story. All the credibility in the world, all the generals and senators and billionaires and magazine covers, could not, in the end, make a broken machine work. Reality doesn't care how impressive your board is. Blood chemistry cannot be charmed. A lie, no matter how beautifully told, no matter how many powerful people repeat it, stays a lie. It just takes someone brave enough to say so. Elizabeth Holmes didn't hack a computer or rob a bank. She did something in some ways more frightening. She hacked trust itself. And if there's a single lesson in how she pulled it off, it's this. She understood, better than almost anyone, that human beings want to believe in the visionary who promises to make the future better. Even the most powerful ones, maybe especially the most powerful ones. She gave them that mirage, wrapped in a turtleneck, delivered in a voice she invented, protected by an army of legends who couldn't tell it was hollow. The machine never worked. Not on the day she dropped out of Stanford. Not at the peak of the $9 billion valuation. Not in the Walgreens wellness centers where frightened patients got results that could shatter their lives. It never worked. And for more than a decade, the smartest, most powerful people in America helped her pretend that it did. So the next time someone stands in front of you radiating total certainty, the next time you feel that pull to believe in someone simply because everyone important already does, think about the room where this started. The loudest confidence tends to cover the emptiest claims, and the people who finally told the truth weren't the powerful ones at the top. They were ordinary people who refused to look away. If that landed, then do the one thing that actually helps. Ask the question the rest of the room is too polite to ask. And if you want to see how a fraud like this looks when it's engineered from the inside, watch the breakdown I've linked next, on the whistleblowers who spent everything to bring it down.